Alright, so hi, I'm good, and I'm going to talk to you about flasks. So flasks are little potions you can use in Path of Exile to kind of buff certain stats or restore life and mana. Those are more common uses of them, or boost your speed. But there's like a lot of different uses for flasks. So there's like a lot of types of flasks. You got evasion flasks, armor flasks, movement flasks, resistance flasks for every type of resistance, crit flasks, which improve your ability to crit. And you have mana flasks of many different varieties. You have your hybrid flasks, which restore life and mana. And you have your different varieties of healing flasks, which restore either life over a long period of time, but a much smaller amount, or over a larger duration, but a larger amount. So if you want more health per second, you could use a sanctified flask, and if you wanted more life total, you could use a hollowed life flask. But that's just like the surface of flasks. Flasks can also roll a lot of different types of mods. So here's a list of just all the mods flasks can roll, and most of them are pretty useless, but a lot of them are used more commonly. So the most common one is the seething type, the seething prefix, which makes the flasks that do recovery, so the life and mana flasks, they recover instantly, and this is usually the most powerful type of flask, because it restores your life instantly. So if you are, about to die, for instance, and you had 2 or 3 seething life flasks, you could start smashing your keyboard, and you get back about 300 life per charge, and if you have 3 flasks and they each have 3 charges, you get back 3,000 life in under a second, which is pretty strong. It can save you pretty well. The second one is bubbling. Is it on here? Yeah, bubbling. Which is almost as strong as seething, but it doesn't have quite the instant recovery of seething. But that's also one that's used. One I really like is panicked, where if you're on low life, so if you are kind of screwed at that instance, you can use it and you get a lot of life back. It's equivalent to about 2 seething flasks. That's something I kind of like to use. One of the others is caustic. So not caustic, sapping. Yeah, sapping. So sapping restores a lot of life. It gives 60% additional life recovery on the flask, but it removes some of your mana on use. But you could counter that by using another mana flask on top of it. So you could use a caustic or a sapping life flask, and then use a seething hybrid flask, so you get all your mana removed from the sapping life flask, but then you get it all back from the seething hollowed flask, and you could restore all your mana instantly, because usually you don't have more than 200 mana or so on a character that uses mana for skills. But you also get a large amount of life recovery and a little bit of boost from the hybrid flask, restoring some of your life. So that's kind of something you can do. One of the other ones is perpetual, which gives increased charge recovery, and this is usually rolled onto utility flasks. So the utility flasks are the ones that do simple utilities, so these ones. The Jade Flask, the Granite Flask, Quartz Flask, Ruby Flask, Sapphire, and Topaz, Amethyst, and Diamond. Because they don't really do anything, don't have any recovery associated with them, they only provide extra utility for the player. They don't do anything extra, that's just utility, and that's the utility flask. These flasks can't roll any of the life recovery mods on them, because they don't do anything that associates them with life. Let's see. So those are just the prefixes, those are the more common ones. Catalyzed, usually not used. Surgeons, if you do a crit build, this gives it gives a flask charge every single time the player crits. The player has to crit, though. You can't use surgeons if you don't crit. If you use totems that crit, it doesn't count as you critting, so you can't restore your flask charges that way. One of the really common mods that usually a Wander or a Crit Dagger builder rolls is a Surgeon's Flask of Iron, or a Surgeon's Granite Flask of Iron Skin. So the Granite Flask gives the buff of 3,000 armor. That's what it does implicitly. The Iron Skin buff, or the Iron Skin suffix on the Flask, gives it an additional 60 to 100% increased armor. So if you didn't have any increased armor passives, now that Flask is giving up to 6,000 armor, just off of its base amount. And if you use the Surgeon's Flask on top of that, and you do a lot of crits and you have a pretty high attack speed, you can pretty much always keep that Flask capped at full charges. So you can almost guarantee that you always have charges coming from that Flask, and you can always keep that Granite Flask up and therefore you can always keep up that additional 6,000 armor, which makes that type of Flask really strong for some specific builds. But a lot of other builds are probably going to go for Perpetual for that increased charge recovery that doesn't require crits. Or, for instance, Avengers, which is a pretty specific mod, but it has its uses. Usually you want Perpetual over Avengers, because, for reasons, I guess. What else? Oh yeah, so I guess I'll get into suffixes. So there are a lot of suffixes that do a lot of things. I'll just go over them one to one. Resistances. They give you extra resistance while the Flask is in effect. That's kind of important. Steadiness. All this only applies while the Flask is in effect. And I'll go over what that means. So resistances, extra resistances. Stun, extra stun recovery. Of heat, it removes chill and freeze. Adrenaline, extra movement speed. Iron Skin, dowsing, reflexes, staunching, fending gluttony, animation. They all do a lot of different types of things. But the most important ones are usually of heat, which removes freeze and chill. Staunching, which removes bleed. It's pretty much not possible currently to go into maps without a staunching Flask because of how strong bleed is. If you get crit by a mob that uses the puncture skill, which inflicts bleeding, if they hit you for around 2,000 damage, which is possible, and you walk one step, and say it's a vulnerability map, you die. There's nothing you can really do about it. So you pretty much have to have a staunching Flask in those scenarios to prevent that sort of case from happening, because it's just not possible to really survive those types of scenarios without it. Fending, which is near useless to everyone who would ever think of using it. It's really useful, but not for pretty much any class. This character actually uses a Fending Flask because it gives knockback to melee attacks. So if I use the puncture skill, I can keep using the puncture skill while on a Granite Flask and knock them back without resorting to heavy strike to use the knockback effect. So that's one of the very rare uses of the Fending Flask. Almost guaranteed it will never be used again. Gluttony, which gives life leech, and Craving, which gives mana leech. Not too useful. Very rarely will you rely on that sort of form of leech. Animation, if you make a summoner class, you're going to have some animation flasks to restore your specters and your animate guardian, for instance. But if you don't use those specific things, or if you only use zombies, it's not going to do much for you. Grounding removes shock, which is very important if you happen to do CI, Chaos Inoculation character, where your effective life pool that the elemental status ailment is rolled against is around 800 to 1,000 life. So pretty much every single time you get hit with lightning damage, and it does more than 300 damage, and that damage happens to cause a shock, you're going to get shocked for the full duration, which is around 10 seconds. So of grounding is pretty important for CI characters. Same with of heat. But usually if you get frozen as a CI character, you're screwed even if you have the most stout stock of heat flasks, because usually if you're getting froze lock in those scenarios, you'll get froze lock again and again and again, and you're going to run out of flask charges before you get out of that scenario. So usually heat flasks aren't desirable, which is why CI characters mostly use either the Wanderlust boots, or the Dream Fragments ring, which gives immunity to freeze. So you're simply immune to that status ailment. And then the last one, which is of warding, it just removes curses. This one isn't that important. It's really useful to have one in some scenarios, but usually not really that useful. In duels, pretty much everyone should have 5 of warding flasks because Temporal Chains exists, and Temporal Chains is to duels what a crowbar is to kneecaps and fair fights. So usually you want to roll nothing but of warding flasks and then use temp chains and win. But that's just for duels. Otherwise, not that important. If you happen to go into an elemental weakness map and there happen to be guys that do curses on top of that lower your resistances even further, it can get pretty dangerous unless you have like a warding flask to remove those immediately. So you could be, 25 overcapped on lightning resistance, then go into an elemental weakness map, and then get cursed by conductivity, and now you're down to like 0 to 10 lightning resistance, and then you get hit by one Piety Storm and die in 2 hits. So that's something that Flask can kind of prevent. What else? What else? So yeah, most Flasks... Oh yeah, all the Flask effects only apply during their duration. And as I said, the utility Flasks, they always apply their full duration. So this Diamond Flask lasts for 3.5 seconds. It will always last for 3.5 seconds. There's not a whole lot that can change that. As far as I know, nothing can really change that. That goes for all the utility flasks, but for the recovery flasks, like the mana flasks, hybrid flasks, and life flasks, there are things that can actually change that duration. So this hollowed life flask, say it restores or recovers 1,000 life over 8 seconds. If I happen to reach my full life capacity while that flask was in effect, the flask effect ends instantly. As soon as I reach my full life, it ends. It works exactly like a life leech. If you hit your full cap, it ends. You lose all that extra buffer that potion or that leech granted you, and the effect ends. Which means it's really kind of undesirable to roll utility effects onto these life flasks, for instance. So usually on life flasks and mana flasks, you want to roll something that applies instantly, and you don't have to rely on that sort of attribute that part of the utility flasks that the suffixes can kind of provide. So kind of want to prevent that. There are certain types of health or mana flasks and health flasks. So there's the hollowed flask, which restores a lot of life over a large duration, and the sanctified, which restores a kind of smaller amount, but restores it really quickly. And as I said, the seething prefix is usually the most desirable one because it restores your life instantly. But usually, or sometimes you don't want to restore your life instantly. Maybe you want to store it over or you could go without the instant recovery, maybe over a slightly longer duration. And that's where this sanctified flasks kind of roll in. So there are usually, I guess, 2 types of flasks you want to use. There's like the hallowed flask and the sanctified flask for life. And then for the mana flasks, you have the sacred flask and the sanctified mana flask. The hallowed mana flask usually isn't desirable because it restores a large amount of mana in a small amount of time. And as I said, as soon as you reach as soon as you fill up your pool, whatever that is, the flask effect ends. So while the flask is in duration, you could be at, say, 100 out of 200 usable mana. You could still be casting skills, and the flask could still be granting you more recovery over that time. But if you don't use your skills, for instance, and it hits that cap, you lose it, and now you've lost all that extra mana recovery you could have had if you weren't recovering mana as fast. So you want to recover mana slower to kind of balance out with your skill use, so the mana flask lasts for its full duration. It's a little bit kind of awkward to get used to, and it sounds kind of counterintuitive and like why you want to restore less of something. But if you want to get the full flask effect out of some types of things. You might want to roll a mana flask with less effect than if you had it, less effect on your mana flask in order to get the full usage out of it. So you could roll a bubbling flask. Yeah, I guess you could roll a bubbling flask or something. If you were like got to no mana, you get some back instantly and then get some back over some time. I don't know. But you kind of want to balance out how that stuff kind of works. All flasks have quality, or all flasks can have quality on them. For any recovery flask, the quality adds extra recovery to it. So, all the recovery flasks get a little bonus. At 20 quality, they get a 20% bonus to life and mana recovery. For all the utility flasks, it adds a duration. So this granite flask lasts for 4.8 seconds, which, this granite flask lasts for 4 seconds, which is, with 20 quality, is 20% more duration. So it's kind of a nice boost. If flasks, or I guess, flasks can't be rare, this is the correct term. Flasks can be unique, but they can't be rare. But magic flasks, if you use a bauble on them, like, bam, this now gets 2%. Bad example, like, actually, because I was at 18%. But if you use a glass explorer's bauble on a magic flask, it gets 2%. If you use it on a non-magic flask, like this one here, it gets 5%. Which means that usually you want to quality up the flasks before you use them. And if you have some sort of common type of flask, like a life or a hallowed life flask or a sanctified life flask, or any of the mana flasks you might need, you usually want to look for a quality version first, and then quality on top of that quality version. So for instance, this is a 11% mana flask. Use the glass explorer's baubles on those, which only requires 2 to get to 20 quality, and then transmute it to make it a magic flask. So that's one way to save on baubles. You can sell flasks to the vendor to get back baubles.
Still breathing, eh?
So Hargan here, if I throw 40 quality worth of flasks at him, if you go over, it'll kind of automatically calculate that and give you back wisdom scraps if you happen to go too much over. But if you give 40 quality of flasks to a vendor, they'll give you back a glass explorer's bauble. So that's one way to kind of easily get back all your, or kind of build up a supply of glass explorer's baubles, because these things actually are pretty rare from the latest patches. They used to be really common and people complained they were too common, and instead of making them more useful, like say rerolling the mod brackets on flasks, they instead made them simply drop less. So glass explorer's baubles are pretty uncommon, so there's a recipe still in to kind of get those back. Anyways, this is probably more than you ever wanted to know about flasks. What else could I possibly talk about? Oh yeah, I guess back to the mods. So, one of the mods you can roll on flasks is actually of steadiness. And this is actually a really interesting mod on flasks, because 40 to 60 stun recovery is a gigantic amount, and people don't really realize how much that is. So stuns last for 250 milliseconds if you get stunned without any stun recovery, but a stun recovery flask can give you up to 60% stun recovery. And say if you roll that onto a jade flask, for instance, which I hope you can see that. Well, a jade flask gives you an incredible boost to evasion, so you could have a jade flask, say, of stun recovery, so you have extra evasion, so you avoid more attacks, therefore get stunned less. And then you have of steadiness, so when you do get stunned, you recover much, much faster, and you probably have some stun recovery on gear anyways, because that's a really, really common mod to roll, especially because there's so many hybrid rolls on gear. Now that can easily put you over the 100% stun recovery mark, which means that stuns only last around 125 milliseconds, and therefore you get that really fast stun recovery, and you don't get stun locked, and you can, run away from really dangerous scenarios without grabbing the unwavering stance keystone. So that's one of the really interesting mods on flasks that I don't think a lot of people really realize. It's more useful than simply being a trash mod. So yeah, it's Flasks. Hope I bored you to death with it. And I'll see you next time.